Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofus is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As we all know that there are farmer strikes happening all around the world, in India, in Greece, in France, and all the parts of the world. Let it be Europe, let it be Asia, let it be South America. And a few days ago, we did a session on the farmer strikes that are happening around the world. But unfortunately, due to there was a lot of background noise and there were some technical issues that were due to which the quality of the session was not very good. So we decided to present uh, this conversation again for you so that we can maintain a good quality and we can also present the conversation the way it should be conveyed to the people. So without wasting your time and without further ado, I welcome Mr. John V. Kofus from Greece, and we are going to discuss the issues that have led to the farmer strike in the different countries, and it's simultaneously at the same time. How are you, Mr. Kofus?
Very well. Thank you very much. Good evening, Assad. Good evening, everyone watching this program. Very important topic. In fact, ongoing. The title, Farmer Strikes Against Global Neoliberalism, implies that this is a strike against a political economy and an institutional structure that has burdened farmers from Europe to Latin America to Asia and Africa. The issue here is not an isolated or country by country case as the media often presents these matters. For example, when you look at the national media of each country covering farmers' strikes, usually in the form of tractors and trucks headed from the rural areas to the urban areas, they present them as an issue of inconvenience for traffic and for the police, of course, the security forces, and as an issue that pertains only to that country. The fact is that there have been, in the last 14 months, more than 65 countries around the world that have had farmer strikes. So this is not about a single country, it's about the world. There is one world economy, the capitalist world economy. It operates under the neoliberal model with modifications, especially in China. China has aspects of neoliberalism, but doesn't abide by the orthodox Washington consensus neoliberal model that a lot of other countries, especially the transatlantic countries, the G7, abide by. So this is a global phenomenon. It's true, I mean, the title of the session today is Farmer Strikes Against Global Neoliberalism. It's true that many farmers protesting in their own minds do not necessarily see this as a struggle against neoliberalism. Many of them are probably not aware what neoliberalism is. They only see their immediate interests. They see how much debt they're in. They see that the cost of production is higher than the price they receive from the wholesale buyers that take the crop off the fields into the market. They see that the cost of energy, a very important issue we're going to talk about today, is rising. They see that the cost of fertilizers is going up. They see that their costs of living are very high. So they see specific issues for themselves, and then they link it to local farmers, and granted, in each country to the national farming community. What they don't see is under the umbrella of neoliberalism, there is common ground across the world for all these farmers taking to the tractors and to the streets to protest what is happening to them. They don't see the commonality of neoliberal policies that governments adopt, from Germany to India to Brazil to the United States and all over the world. So that's as an introduction. I wanted to mention that you did say that last week there were, of course, simultaneous tractor strikes in India and in Greece. Obviously, it's true. In fact, we did the first session we did on this was last week, when this thing was unfolding, when these events were unfolding. Clearly, Greece and India don't have much in common except neoliberalism. They both operate under the neoliberal umbrella, policy umbrella. India is a country of almost 1.5 billion people. Greece is just under 11 million. So it's a tiny country. And yet the farmers in both countries have very common grounds. There is a sense of solidarity without the realization that there is a sense of solidarity. And that is that the policies impacting both communities are the same. Now, I want to start by pointing out that neoliberalism is a phase of capitalism which starts during the 1970s as an experiment in Augusto Pinochet's Chile, after the CIA overthrew President Salvador Allende, and the United States sent a team of economists from the University of Chicago and used Chile as an experiment to impose neoliberal policies, to experiment with neoliberal policies in every sector, including, by the way, in agriculture, from mining, because Chile is a major exporter of minerals, by the way, historically, from the 19th century to the 20th century and 21st century. This is a mining exporting company, but also an agricultural company. They experimented with neoliberal policies in Chile. Then in the late 70s, when Margaret Thatcher took over the United Kingdom as prime minister, she started neoliberal policies there. They impacted the agricultural sector, and then in the United States in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we do see massive consolidation of farming. That is, small farms and medium-sized farms going bankrupt, and major large farms overtaking the smaller farms, becoming much more prominent. This was not an accident. This was deliberate policy of based on the neoliberal model, namely the assumption that deregulation, which goes to the heart of neoliberalism, deregulation is essential, which means that the mechanisms in place up until the neoliberal model, which were regulatory mechanisms imposed since the 1930s Great Depression, when the Keynesian, named after John Maynard Keynes, the economist, the British economist, the Keynesian safety net, the price structure and the regulatory measures, the minimum support price structure, whether in the Indian subcontinent, in the United States, or in Europe, by the way, that was there to protect the farming community, to make sure that these people continue. Those things with neoliberalism were eroded. So deregulation was one thing, and that deregulation allowed the large wholesalers to go into the producers, especially the small scale producers, and buy at the price they dictated. The other thing that happens with neoliberalism, of course, is fiscal policy. Neoliberal fiscal policy, that is the tax structure, favors the large producers. There was a drop in the tax burden of the wealthy in general. This includes the wealthy farmers, and a rise in the smaller and medium-sized farms. Like I said, we see this crisis starting in its embryonic stage in Britain and the United States in the 1980s, and it continues to this day. Obviously, we have seen it much more intensely in the last few years because the pandemic combined with the war in Ukraine made this much, much worse. And the fact is that it's also coming in the aftermath of the Great Recession of 2008. The Great Recession of 2008, which was a manifestation of the crisis of neoliberalism, impacted the farming community. Now, I want to go into one issue because many people watching this may think that, well, you know, under capitalism, there was always the big fish eats the small fish, and there was always concentration of big farming, and this is how capitalism works. So what's so special about neoliberalism? And that's a fair question. I do want to point out that the first transition and transformation of the farming community, the agricultural sector, took place during the Industrial Revolution of this includes China, which industrializes very late in the 20th century. Every country in the world that undergoes an industrial and the secondary sector of production, that is the manufacturing sector, cannot do it. I used to tell my undergraduates, my undergraduate economic history students, that you cannot have an industrial revolution unless you have a simultaneous agricultural revolution. It's just not possible. And the reason is because of the inexorable link between the two sectors and the division of labor. Before a country industrializes, and there are plenty of them today which are not industrialized, what you see is a massive labor force occupied in the primary sector of production. Primary sector of production is not just agriculture, by the way, although it's a huge part of it, and animal husbandry, it's also forestry, fisheries, and mining. So in England, before the industrialization, England is the first one, that's why I'm bringing it up. In the 18th century, before it industrialized in the 18th century, the vast majority of the population was out in the country, farming in the fields, and most of the people farming in the fields had small plots of land, and they produced most of the food, and it was usually for self-consumption, very little for surplus. So the transition, and here's the key to where which ties in with neoliberalism, the transition necessarily entailed going from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture. To go into commercial agriculture, in other words, producing commercial crops, crops for export on a global scale, by the way, meant that small-scale farming was not consistent with the goals of industrial capitalism. The other thing is, of course, a lot of people had to be transferred, if you will, against their will. But the policy did this. Parliament passed, I forget how many pieces of legislation the British Parliament passed in order to make sure that the farming segment of the economy in England in the 18th century, and this is no different with all countries industrializing, it became very difficult for them to sustain a livelihood in the countryside. Taxes were raised, inability to, of course, compete with the large farmers, cost of living, all of these things were started going up, forced a huge segment of the population from the rural sector to the urban sector. So this transition, this division of labor is a very important element to transitioning to commercial agriculture. The other thing, of course, that happens with industrialization of any country, beginning with England, is agriculture becomes mechanized. Who can afford the machinery? The larger operators. The small operator is not going to be able to afford the machinery. The bank is not going to provide the loan. So they sell out. They give up what they have. Now, it is true that in huge countries, India included, to this day, it is remarkable that the vast majority of the farming community, which is around 44%, by the way, of the labor force in India, which is remarkable for a country that supposedly has transitioned to the secondary sector. But this is a huge percentage of the labor force to have in the primary sector of production. But 85% of those engaged, of those 44% engaged in agriculture, own under 5 acres of land, which means that they are subsistence farmers. In other words, whatever they grow for personal consumption, and whatever they have left, the little that's left, they sell in order to live off. Indian scholars have pointed out, agricultural economists from India have pointed out, that the irony of this is a huge number of Indian farmers, these small farmers, cannot afford to live under current conditions. One of the reasons that we have seen the farming movement, the farm tractor movement, and the mass protests against the neoliberal consolidation of farming, the big farming operations, is because they just cannot live under, given the higher cost of living, increasingly higher cost of living of everything, they can't live under these conditions. Now, we have, of course, the issue of who is responsible for providing the, who is the driving force and who is responsible for providing the advice to the government, whether it's India or the United States or Germany, to engage, to adopt neoliberal policies. And every time when we look, it is large farmers. in the United States, and I'll bring up India too. There are very few families in India. They're billionaires. In the United States, just like in India, the Indian billionaires are behind the policy that's driving the neoliberal changes in the deregulation movement, the tax structure, the consolidation. And also, by the way, I have to point out something that's very important here. Governments, whether it's in India or the United States or in Europe, provide subsidies under neoliberalism, taxpayer money, to large farming operations as well as animal husbandry operations. For example, the pork industry, the beef industry, they get subsidies, corporate subsidies. Corporate farming receives subsidies from government, while those smaller and mid-sized farmers who had been receiving subsidies and had lower tax burden under the Keynesian model have seen those cut. The reason for that is because billionaires who own companies that own vast tracts of land, millions of acres, are behind those policies, because those people finance the campaign. The Adani family, for example, in India, and there are about 15 large billionaire individuals, families in the United States that own millions of acres of land, and they are also in favor of neoliberal agricultural policy, meaning deregulation, corporate subsidies, corporate farming subsidies, cutting subsidies, and raising taxes on the small farmer. So you have a large consolidation. By the way, the interesting thing is, if you follow these billionaires, I keep mentioning billionaire farmers, if you follow, they don't necessarily have, with the exception of few of those families, they don't necessarily have the bulk of their investments in land, yet they own millions of acres of land. They may be in the entertainment industry or in high tech. And yet, I mean, Bill Gates comes to mind, although he's not the largest farmer. He's not one of the largest 15, one of the largest 15 in the United States. But yet he comes to mind because I think he owns about 300,000 acres or something. He doesn't own 21, 2-3 million that others own. But yet these people are not in the agricultural sector, but own enormous amounts of land. And they have the ability, they have the deep pockets to outcompete any small or mid-sized farmer. And this has been an issue of vast importance. Now, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the OECD here in Europe, large organizations that that have enormous influence in policy with individual governments around the world, all favor neoliberal policies. And neoliberalism has tied in with the environmental movement. And many people assume, without going into it in detail, well, there's nothing wrong with the government insisting that farmers are more environmentally conscious. Let me give you one example that's very important. Farmers complain that the cost of energy is too high. Okay, fair enough. It is too high. It has been, especially since the Ukrainian war, when the U.S. and NATO decided to support Ukraine against Russia, and we won't go to the merits of that issue. But when the US decided they were going to support Ukraine against Russia, they imposed, the US and the G7, along with India and a number of other countries, imposed sanctions and punitive tariffs and measures that immediately sent the prices of energy way up. Agriculture depends very heavily on energy. This was a burden to the farming sector throughout the world. The other thing that happened, that this is not so much talked about, especially in the Western media, is that Ukraine and Russia combined are the world's largest producers of grain. Historically, since the 19th century, when Ukraine was under the Russian Empire during the Romanov dynasty before Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was considered the breadbasket to the world. Now, what happens as a result of this war, which this, again, a separate set of issues here. The fact is, there has been a lot of illegal trade, contraband trade, with individual shipping companies, by the way, and through India and China, especially India. They buy the surplus that Russia has, whether it's in energy or grain, and in the case, and they sell it at profiteering prices. However, in the case of grain, they flood the markets and undersell local producers. One country that exposed this and made a case out of it because made a big grievance on this issue is Poland. Poland is right next to Ukraine. It hosts most of the refugees that left Ukraine when the war started and went to Poland, by the way. It's right next door. And Poland is very anti-Russian. Historically, Poland is very anti-Russian. Very pro-US, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine. However, Ukraine dumped grain. Dumping, by the way, let me explain the term dumping in international trade terms. Dumping is used, it's a technical term, it doesn't mean dump. It means that you flood the market, that a country or a company floods the market with a surplus product and it undersells the local producers. Well, this is a major issue for the entire country of Poland, and especially for the agricultural producers of Poland. The agricultural community of Poland then turns to the government and says, you have to help us here. You allowed for free trade, which is another trait of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is in favor of lifting all trade restrictions, allowing foreign investment in the farming and the agricultural sector, flooding the local agricultural economy with foreign investment, gobbling up the best farming pieces, and also flooding the market with surplus product. That means the local producer is undersold. In the case of the Polish people, the Polish farmers, they complain to the government. The government, whose policy it was, the government brought this policy about. It was no one else's fault except the Polish government. They said, well, it's Ukraine's fault. They shouldn't have been doing this. Actually, it wasn't Ukraine's fault. It's part of the neoliberal system. Neoliberalism entails globalization. It means you have ideally as few tariffs as possible. And this is one example. Now, when the Poles look at this issue, they look at it in isolation. Oh, it's just a bilateral issue. It's us, Polish farmer versus the Ukrainian farmer. When in fact, it is part of a neoliberal umbrella policy, which is global. In your country, in Pakistan, for example, your government, the current government, allowed for the sale of about 1 million acres to foreign investors over the objection of local small and medium-sized farmers in your country, in Pakistan. This, obviously, the farmers there, this political party, I believe I mentioned it in the last session when we were talking about this, realized that this was detrimental to their interest, that this company would come in, undersell them. They would have to compete. They know they can't. You cannot compete with large farming operations. They have what's called in the market pricing power. In other words, they can just undersell, even if they go 10% lower. That's still 10% lower. So this just illustrates another issue. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this specific one because it's global, because governments try to place it in the framework of nationalism, and this is dangerous stuff. And unfortunately, farmers they fall for this, when in fact it's not a nationalist issue. This is part of globalization. The fact is that governments know that the farming community is culturally conservative, religiously, socially conservative. They know that. And they know that they will take the bait if the government says, well, you know what? It's them over there. It's our neighbor. They're trying to do something. They're undermining us. So they frame it in nationalism terms. And by the way, I have to tell you that 19th century scholars, 19th century, 150 years ago, during the revolution of 1848, 1840s, by the way, there was a major farming crisis. It's called the potato famine, the Irish potato famine, but because it was based in Ireland. But there was a major depression, like the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the 1840s, there was something like it. And back then, the issue was framed in nationalism terms. And there were a few people who were saying, well, this is all over Europe. And in fact, it impacted non-Europe because it impacted the colonies of the Europeans, it impacted the United States, of course, Canada, Australia. And the same thing today. They try to frame these issues in terms of nationalism when in fact they're not. They're not nationalist issues. They're global issues because neoliberalism is a global system. I'm going to stop there, pause there rather, and ask you if you have any questions, because I've been talking for some time without us for half an hour or so. And
That's all right. I was enjoying it. Okay, Mr. Kofos, there is, as you said, that the billionaires who are occupying a lot of land, and they are, trying to impose taxes through governmental policies and all that to oppress farmers, basically. So. And you also said that it's not possible to, combat or tackle the large corporations. What do you see? I mean, how can this farmer strike succeed? I mean, can farmers achieve their goals with that?
Yes, there have been a number of very important scholarly works. One is actually from India. He's done some work, and very good work. And he among others, by the way, in Europe as well. I don't want to just single out India, but India is where all of this started anyway. 3 years or so, 3.5 years ago, in September 2020, during the pandemic, that's when we have, in the middle of the pandemic, as though that were not enough, we have in India the Modi government, which is a conservative, far-right government, Hindu nationalist government, passing 3 laws basically that devastates the rural community, the farming, the agricultural community in India. One scholar who did some work on this points out that, to their credit, gradually the farmers of India, small and medium-sized farmers of India, realized that they needed to be in solidarity with as many people as possible, including labor unions. So they reached out and asked for the support of people in other sectors. And in fact, they did get that support. And that was a major accomplishment for them. And that is one strategy, and that is reaching out to other organizations. In India, they responded. And the reason they responded in India is because trade unions realized that the Modi government was really not just after, these policies were not just after the farming community. These were after the working class. This was after the lower middle class and the working class. It impacted the vast majority of the population. So that realization, unfortunately, has not sunk in all countries. But that's very important to recognize that neoliberal policies are not just aimed at one segment of the economy and the social structure. That neoliberal policies are, as Noam Chomsky has pointed out repeatedly, at class warfare. Neoliberalism means you declare war on the lower classes, on the working people, and the middle class, and the lower middle class, especially the lower middle class. And so this is this is exactly what we have witnessed, unfortunately. And this brings me to a very important issue here. Unfortunately, farmers have permitted themselves to be taken advantage of, to be used, to be manipulated in some countries. I'm not saying in all countries, I'm saying in some countries, by the far right. In Holland, a public relations firm created a political party to take advantage of the disgruntled farmers in Holland. And the political party was a far-right party, and they, with hollow rhetoric, cheap rhetoric, what I call cheap rhetoric, populist rhetoric, they were telling them, yes, we're with you, we're against the European Union bureaucrats, we're against the migrants who come in and undermine your interests. So they turned it into a nationalist, xenophobic issue. All of a sudden, it was the migrants. And Holland, by the way, Holland is a multicultural society. Holland has people. I've been to Holland. Holland has people from all over the world. And Holland, and a number of farmers went for that. They took the bait. Not all, but a number of farmers took the bait. Unfortunately, in Germany, when the farmers, is another country, obviously, unfortunately, with a very bad past with the far right wing, namely the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler, the farmers in Germany protesting, big strikes in Germany, by the way, big farming strikes, one of the world's largest economy, face the farming community in Germany facing a crisis. There, the far right has tried to appeal. In France, huge strikes in Paris, included, by the way, in this case. Marine Le Pen, the head of the far right party, which may very well she may very well become the next president of France in the next election. She took advantage of that. The fact is, none of these far right parties serve the interests of the farming community, of the small farmer, because all of them are neoliberal. We had neoliberal heads of state. Modi right now is a neoliberal head of state. He had the support of a great deal of those farmers that he went after in 2020. What did he do? He sent the police after them, and he tried to crush them and undermine and continue to undermine their interests. Now he gave in on some specific issues, and this is very typical, by the way. All of these governments, from India to Greece to Europe to Latin America, they will go back one or two steps, give in on one or two issues specifically, and all of them, by the way, it's like they're following the same textbook case. We'll do this in terms of policy. Well, I'll make some concessions on, for example, gasoline tax. Let's just bring up an example. However, the neoliberal goals of all these governments, whether they're far-right populist, whether it's the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, the current president of Hungary, Viktor Orban, or former President Trump, all of these people, they were all far right-wing. They didn't do anything for the farm. They harmed the interests of the small farmer, the medium-sized farmers. So, and yet, to this day, a segment, I should say, a percentage of the farming community still falls for it because they're culturally and religiously and ideologically conservative. So they tend to fall for the populist right-wing rhetoric, when in fact the political economy of neoliberalism operates under the large umbrella from the far right governments like Bolsonaro, Modi, Trump, Orban, these governments, to governments that are liberal to the center. They operate under that large umbrella. The system, the capitalist system, historically for 500 years, has been able to operate under governments from socialist, not communist like the Soviet Union and China, but from socialist to all the way to neo-Nazi, neo-fascist parties. So the issue here is that the farm movement, which is a protest against neoliberalism, although many farmers are not even aware of that, but what they're really saying is, we don't like our policies. Many of them are in debt. Since I mentioned that, the universal element in the farming community across all the 65 countries that have had farm protests in the last year and a half is debt. One of the reasons that India and the United States, I believe I might have mentioned this before, have had a suicide epidemic among farmers. These people are in debt, they don't know what to do, and they kill themselves. And there is a sense of pride, by the way, among farmers, and a sense that that they take it personally, as though it's a personal failure, when in fact it's an institutional failure. It's not their fault. This is the thing that they fail to realize, that it's not something they have failed in. The system has failed them. The system has failed them. They haven't. They still go out and work every day. They don't do anything different from one day to the next. the fiscal policy changes, monetary policy changes, they cut loans, government, by that's the other thing. Government cuts loans, makes it very difficult for them to get subsidized government loans to operate their farms. Another issue, by the way, since I mentioned death and suicides and the desperation of these people and how they internalize, human beings are amazing at internalizing events that are externally stimulated. The fact is that the policy, the fiscal policy and the loan policy have nothing to do with it. But another, it's an external policy. It has nothing to do with them personally as human beings. It has nothing to do with them as being virtuous or anything. In any case, another issue that the government has stressed is, well, you have, they tell the farmers, and this is where the environmental movement links in, go out and get alternative energy sources. Okay, how? Borrow the money and get the alternative solar energy, wind energy. Those solar panels are very expensive. The wind turbines are very expensive. The only operators that can do that are the large operators, the large farmers. So they add, and this is where the urban, especially the urban liberal environmental movement fails to grasp that, okay, we're all in favor of clean energy. And I agree entirely, we mentioned this before, Assad, that I agree entirely with the science globally, that yes, there is global warming. However, there is a way to move gradually toward limiting global warming without burdening the farming sector. And this is an issue where, again, politicians have argued that, well, the farmers are against the environmental movement. They are not interested in the green economy. Well, that's not the issue at all. The issue is if you buy the solar panel, even if the bank gives them the money to buy the solar panels, they go deeper into debt. And the question is, when are they going to repay the debt? So that's another dimension of what neoliberalism has done. It has created. There was a study when I was writing the book on neoliberalism. I ran into a study that somebody in New York did called rentier society under neoliberalism, which means that eventually everybody's going to, among the masses, is going to be a renter. No ownership. Ownership is going to be confined to very few people, and that's it. And this applies to the agricultural community as well. Okay, I'm going to pause again and ask you if you have any questions, and then I'll go on other stuff too. Good.
Okay, sir, there is one thing that you mentioned, that farmers often consider themselves to be responsible for the failures, which you said that it was an institutional failure. But farmers believe that, farmers are made to believe that it is their own failure.
An excellent question. Okay, one thing that's interesting about that is that the media, very important here, the media, as well as leaders, the politicians, community leaders, so forth, they figure, well, if you're failing in your farm, it's not my fault. You're the one failing in your farm. It's not your neighbor's fault, not the government, it's your fault. Well, this is a very old argument, actually, Assad. This argument goes back to the early Industrial Revolution in England. When the Industrial Revolution started, and like I said earlier, no country in the world has ever been able to industrialize unless it simultaneously had an agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution is imperative in order to have an industrial revolution, because you need the people to come out of the rural sector into the factories, and you need to increase the production of farming, okay? And I'm going to talk about that issue, which is the increased production of farming, because under neoliberalism, the term is efficiency, agricultural efficiency, which is equated with market efficiency. So people have been made historically to feel that their failures as individuals, when in fact, when they examine their own lives, their own work habits, they see that they actually work even harder, not less, more, as things get worse for them, and yet things are getting worse. Although they work more, they and their families work even more, and things still don't go their way. Well, if the large producer comes in and buys product at a rock bottom price, and that same product is sold 10 times higher at the supermarket, that means that producer and the retail store that's selling it, the supermarket chain that's selling it to the mass consumer, that's who's making the profit. So profiteering is made by the middleman, and by corporate traders, by the way. Okay, I just remembered another dimension here of neoliberalism and agriculture. And there is a lot of literature on this issue. And it's called the financialization of the economy and financialization of agriculture. The fact is that the producer does not determine the price of the product. The price of the product is determined by commodities brokers. Commodities brokers, whether in London or in Chicago, sit behind a computer and they gauge at production of coffee. Let's take one product, coffee. Coffee in East Africa, Latin America, they determine the price of coffee. Not the coffee producer in Kenya or in Colombia or Brazil. The people who make the bulk of the profits are these parasitic middlemen from the trader, who does nothing except sit behind the computer and trade on behalf of investors, and he or she gets their cut, obviously, as a broker, right? People speculate on commodities because neoliberalism, under the financialization of that, the value of the economy is based on its speculative value, on its speculative worth, not on any empirical, any sort of tangible metrics, but on what I, as an investor, am willing to bet that it's going to be, the price of coffee is going to be in what we call, for example, the July contracts in commodities exchanges, right? And you, at the other end, are willing to sell those contracts, and we negotiate, the broker negotiates the price, and there is a sale. And we determine, we're the investors, we determine the price of those things. I'll just briefly tell you, I had, when I worked in higher education, one of the persons I knew was a small farmer. And he said, at the university, and he said, I said, you can't be making any money. This is back in the 1990s. And he said, no, I actually lose money. And he had actually, I think, 70 or 75 acres of land. Not 5 acres, which is the average for 85% of the Indian rural population. Imagine, right? He was losing money. He had 75, he was losing money. He also had some hogs, losing money on that too. I said, how do you stay in business? He said, well, every morning I get up and I look at the commodities market and I speculate. I put bets on it, and the profit margin I make from that, I put it back into the farm, and that's how I keep going. So he wasn't making money out of the farm. He was making money speculating. This is how parasitic the farm economy, it's the entire economy. But like Bernie Sanders, the senator from the U.S., the independent senator from the U.S., used to say when he ran for president in 2016 and 2020, he used to say the economy is rigged. Of course it's rigged, because what he meant is it's based on speculation. So my friend at the university wasn't making any money. In fact, he was subsidizing the farm, which wasn't 5 acres, like the average in India for 85% of the rural population, 75 acres. He was subsidizing, speculating on commodities. And he was pouring that money back into this farm so he keep it going, because he loved farming. That's the other thing. A lot of people, by the way, in farming, and I've told you this before, I have relatives in farming, they enjoy it. A lot of them do. Many of them, they enjoy the life. They enjoy the lifestyle. There's a romance about, I guess, farming. Very hard work. And but the fact is, it's commoditized. That's what, when economists write that the farming economy is commoditized, like everything else under neoliberalism, that's what they mean. It's subject to speculation. When something is subject to speculation, that means that the money is made by speculators. It's not made by the producer. Okay, I'm going to pause again. Catch my breath here. Go ahead.
Mr. Kofos, what do you think that how much education plays an important role, and being well aware of things, and how much do farmers need to have an education, or like the formal education? Personally, I'm not in favor of the formal education that we obtain in schools and colleges, because what I feel from my personal experience. Orange color corn. Well, can you hear me?
Yes, I think that education. I'm glad you mentioned the issue of education.
Yes,
I think education
actually,
plays a major role.
Yes. So, do farmers need to have the formal education like like we do to schools? We do go to schools and colleges and all that, and we obtain that education. Do they need to have that formal education, and what role can it play in their work and their lives?
Assad, you're absolutely right. Education plays a role, because I also have a friend who, he's now retired, but he worked for the Ministry of Agriculture, and he was sort of an inspector. He went around advising farmers on policy and so forth. And the fact is, they need information in today's information society, high-tech information society. They need information on everything, from pesticides to agrochemicals. They need information. They need information on pricing. They need information on when to sell. They need information on where the global market stands. I had one farmer several months ago who said to me, where do you think the prices of orange juice is going to be, which is a commodity traded in the commodities market in Chicago and in London, because apparently there was a global shortage of oranges, partly because of the California and Florida situation. And he was expecting he was expecting, this is a good story actually, I'm glad I thought of it. He was expecting the price of oranges to triple and make money, when in fact, that's not what happened. When he finally sold, the result was that he sold well below where he thought. And he was saying, but you told me it did triple in the world, you know. I said, yeah, you didn't, it tripled for those trading the product, the commodity. It did, the product didn't triple for you. The profits were made by those investing in the commodities exchange, not by you. Now, education. If my friend that I used to work in the university did not have an education, didn't know how to manipulate the system itself, he would have sold the farm. And he was the first to admit it, because his neighbors had sold the small farms. The only reason he was keeping the farm is because he knew well enough, he knew exactly how to proceed and to keep the farm going through speculative ventures, through speculation in the market. Not that he was always winning, but he was making enough to support the market. Education also makes a difference in other respects. Education makes a difference because they should know which politician is going to favor the policies that favor their interests, and which politician. That is very important, because a lot of farmers are misguided about policy, by the way. They are easily taken by political rhetoric. Modi sold them a bill of goods and they bought it. Then he turns around during the pandemic and he implements the so-called the three famous farm laws in India. And surprise, surprise, we have farm tractor protests in India. They need to be educated about politicians. They also need to be educated about how to proceed with solidarity movements we talked about earlier. You mentioned, well, what should they do? Well, they should be educated enough to know that if the government is adopting these policies to burden my interests and to favor the Adani family, to favor the billionaires, and doesn't matter what family it is, of billionaires, who own vast agricultural tracts, not just in India, but throughout the subcontinent and in Africa as well, by the way. And they do the exact same thing in those countries. Whatever they do in India, they do everywhere else. Their interests are the same. They're going to advise, they do advise those governments to adopt those policies. South Africa, by the way, they do the exact same thing in South Africa. So they need to know enough to form solidarity groups with trade unions, because the trade unions are on the receiving end of these neoliberal policies. So education makes a difference in every respect, from knowing what pesticides to use, from knowing the market, knowing when to sell. Like I said, the fellow who was talking to me a few months ago about, he's a college educated, and I don't know why he believed that just because the price of oranges in the world market had tripled, that he would get 3 times as much. He's the producer. He's the producer. He gets the lowest possible price. He actually sold below market. Not only did he get 3 times higher, he got below last year's prices. So he was surprised. He was shocked, and then he started blaming the government. He was saying, well, it's the government's fault because they allowed for this to happen. So the immediate reaction of the farmer is, and that's why they have tractor protests. Well, we're going to drive our tractors to New Delhi and tell the government to do this. And it's just us, when in fact, it's a neoliberal policy that impacts all of society. And that's the most important message. And that is, neoliberalism is not just about one sector. Neoliberalism isn't a tiny umbrella over agriculture. Neoliberalism is a societal, global movement.
Okay, sir, it was a very insightful conversation, and I'm hopeful that we are able to provide practicable solutions for the issue. Well, what is any final message or any advice you want to give to the farmers, the governments, the policymakers, the capitalists, and the entire society in terms of how to make things better for farmers? And farmers are an important element of our society. If there is no farmer, there is no food. And as the protests were taking place in Athens, they had carried the posters, no farmer, no food. So, is there any final message or anything that I may have missed? You can also share that if I may have missed to ask, and if there is any final message, any solution that you would like to convey. You can also
Yeah,
discuss
I
if I
want
have
to.
missed any
Yeah,
question.
yeah, I agree with you, and I want to start with the comment you made that no farmers, no food. In Paris, the French farmers. I remember when they took their tractors down to the center. They were telling people, it was a cry for help. Look, for Christ's sake, we're providing your food for you. Help us. It was a cry of desperation. Like, we are the food producers. Without us, no food. In Germany, the same thing. We're providing your food. They want society. That's what I noticed, by the way. Worldwide, they want society to recognize that they are the people growing the food, therefore sustaining life. Agriculture, I've mentioned this before, is the first endeavor of human beings. When civilization started, 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia, it started when human beings stopped being food gatherers, gathering, in other words, food, and being nomadic, moving constantly, and animal hunters. And they sat down and they began cultivating land. So civilization was built on agriculture until the first industrial revolution in the world, which happened in England in the 18th century. For thousands of years, agriculture was the basis of civilization. I think what is happening today is that this sector, which has to do with the survival of humanity, is taken over by a handful of large agribusinesses, large corporations, and billionaires worldwide. Coincidentally, a number of billionaires and agribusinesses have said that there is surplus food. The issue to feed the entire population of the world, by the way, and still have food left over. That's what surplus food means. There is more than enough food to feed the world and have food left over. However, it's not profitable to do that. In other words, as tragic as it sounds, it's profitable to let people starve, because the profit margin in having people not having access to food means that you have a larger profit margin. Right now, there is more than enough food to feed the entire planet and still have food left over. So it's not the issue. The Malthusian theory, I've mentioned again this before, doesn't apply here. The idea that there are too many people, not enough natural resources. No, there is more than enough food. It's just that the concentration of food production, and it's becoming even more concentrated, is making it impossible to feed the world. China has illustrated in the last 30 years that it isn't necessary not to feed the entire population. They have eliminated extreme poverty. I've mentioned this again before. They have eliminated extreme poverty. India has tried; they haven't succeeded, but they're trying. They're trying. And India and China, of course, have the largest population on the planet. The fact is, we do have the means to produce even more. A lot of these billionaires and companies that own large tracts of land, Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland Company, they global companies, have millions and millions of acres. They leave the land uncultivated, deliberately. And a lot of the billionaires leave it uncultivated. And environmentalists come along, and here's where it gets controversial with liberals versus conservatives, by the way. Environmentalists come along, and they go, that's good, that's good. We don't need that. We don't need, see, they're conservation because actually they do it not because they're conservationists, because they believe in climate change, although they insist that they believe in climate change. They do it because they know that if you reduce the supply, you're going to have a higher profit margin, whether it's the supply of food or the supply of energy. And food is a commodity that's part of a speculative business. It's speculated in the commodities markets in London and in Chicago. They determine more or less the prices of the world in commodities. So I think that what we have is a very bad situation with the super concentration of food production. It doesn't matter that the small and medium-sized farmer is the producer. The entities that control, but what are they going to do with it? I'll give you an example. My friend was waiting for the prices of oranges to go somewhere a little bit higher. And he, I'm the producer, I'm in charge. Actually, he paid exactly what the wholesaler told him to pay. He wasn't in charge of anything. He was in charge of nothing. It's whatever the wholesaler, the price the wholesaler determined. And then he turns around, oh, it's the government's fault. So the fact is that when you yield that kind of power to so few people, that's not democracy, by the way. And one of the things that concerns me is that this farm protest movement against neoliberalism is, in fact, a manifestation of mass movements to come, because what I see is down the road that governments are going to react with force. I see more and more authoritarian measures against strikers, against people, whether it's farmers or workers. And that's unfortunate, but that's what I see. And that's why solidarity of the farmers with the workers is very important. Any last words? Go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Corpus. Well, first of all, it's very, very unfortunate situation that the capitalists and the billionaires are, creating a lot of hunger in the world. And just as you mentioned that there is a lot of food, there is no shortage of food, but still people are dying of hunger, and farmers are being oppressed, and they cannot even they cannot lead good and comfortable lives. They cannot even fulfill the basic necessities of life, and they are in such a miserable condition. And that is all because of capitalist policies, the neoliberal policies of accumulating more capital. That's very unfortunate. So as far as I'm concerned, the society should care for farmers, people should care for farmers, the governments should care for farmers, because If there is no farmer, there is no food. Farmers are important for feeding us. If we don't look after them, if we don't care after them, they are the most important elements of our society. If we do not look after them, how can we survive? We cannot survive. We cannot live if we don't have food to eat. That is what my message is, that all the world is should be all the world leaders and the society should pay attention, because these strikes and these issues are in all the countries, if I'm not wrong, and if not in all countries, in most of the then in most of the countries, farmers are protesting for their rights. They are fighting, and they are crying that the governments and the billionaires pay attention to their problems and try to make their lives better. That is all what I have to say, and I believe Mr. Kofas, you wanted to say something. If you want to conclude it, you can conclude it. I have said what I had to
I,
say. My final
I,
message is
I, I, yeah, I agree with you. There are there are politicians that, if very few politicians who are conscientious, they believe that there is a crisis. They see that there is a real crisis. You cannot possibly not see that. I mean, it's obvious. When you look at statistics, the United Nations, by the way, has an agricultural sub-agency which compiles statistics on what is happening to agriculture worldwide, and they recognize if viewers are interested in going to the United Nations website and looking at those statistics, what you see from the year 1980 to 2020 is you'll see a drop in small farm and mid-sized farms worldwide. And the other interesting statistic, especially from 2000, I believe, to 2020, which I recently saw on the United Nations website, is when you look at, this is really tragic, when you look at the inflation rate in the last 20 years, and then you look at the food price index, in other words, inflation for foodstuffs, the inflation for food far outpaces the general inflation rate, the overall inflation rate. And then recently, when I looked at from India,
very sad.
I'm sorry. And recently, when I looked at some statistics about India and the fact that the very people producing the food, are not able to afford the means to sustain themselves, and their farmers. I mean, it's not even subsistence farming isn't enough for them to keep them going. That was a tragedy. I mean, when I saw that, that's a tragedy in itself. And it's no wonder that, they get on their tractors and whatever trucks and they go out and protest, knowing, by the way, they will be met by police. They knew that because it was evident in every strike. They were taking precautions. They knew that the government would send out the police on them. And so, it takes a lot for people, when I used to teach students, sitting back, we're saying, well, maybe why would they, they're just aggressive. That's where they're, and I said, no, they're not aggressive. Nobody wants to leave their farm. They want to work on their farm and go out, in a major city on a truck and protest, or even go into a protest in their local. They don't want to do that. They tend to be conservative. Farmers tend to be, agricultural population in general tends to be conservative. They don't want to do that. They have. It's a sense. It's indicative of desperation on their part, and that's all it is. It's a cry for help. Help me. That's about it.
Well, it was a very alarming situation, and it was a very, very beautiful line that you just said, that the food inflation outpaces the general inflation. That is
Yeah.
just for making
Yeah.
capitals, these people are doing a lot of injustice to the society. That's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
We just hope
And they,
that they
yeah.
just uh, look things that they prefer the world, the prosperity of the world over their own monetary benefits. That's all what I have to say.
Yeah.
Do you have to say
Yes, I
something,
agree.
sir?
No, I think that we covered this very well. I think it was. I think it's important for people to recognize that this is indicative of. I look at it from a wider perspective. I see it as a social crisis. It's not. I don't. To me, it's not just farm. It's a social crisis, and the social crisis is a response to the neoliberal model of the economy, which is creating the crisis. This is a manufacture crisis. Um, and it's not the fault of the farmer. The farmer gets up and, like I said before, I said it 3 or 4 times, gets up in the morning and goes to work and goes to the field or attends to the animals. That's what they do every day. That's what they. It's not their fault. There are policies that were designed to undercut them because larger interests profit, and that's what it's about. But that undercuts the social fabric of society, and that's the issue here: the undermining of the social fabric. Okay, I
So,
guess.
okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I am hopeful that the session that we held last week on the farmers' strike, there were some technical issues, there were some noise issues, and some people even complained of that. So I have tried my best to present a better conversation for you. I have tried to handle quality, and even some people complained about my lack of participation in the previous session. So I have asked different questions. I have also presented my own opinions in this session. I'm thankful to all of you, and it's very important to pay attention to the plight of farmers and the overall plight of the society. Thank you, Mr. Kofus. Thank you to all viewers. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.